Okay, so today and next week, we are going to be reviewing three categories of central nervous system depressants. Technically, the third category is a subtype of category two. Um, and technically, even the category that we're going to be looking at, I believe it's the following week or the week after that. Anyway, when we talk about the opiates, technically, okay, from a pharmacological perspective, or at least from a pharmacodynamic perspective, it could be argued that the opiates are a subtype of the depressants. They're analgesics, okay, because they have to do with pain relief or pain mitigation, but they are technically depressants for reasons that are um, complicated and simple, but we'll get to that when we talk about the opiates. For us, today we're talking about alcohol. Next week, we are talking about the sedative hypnotics and the inhalants. I think they're covered in the same week. I can't remember. I'm so sorry if I'm wrong about that. Either way, they're very closely kind of packed together. So we're going to get started on alcohol. Like I said, some of these slides I don't really know that much about because they're Dan's. So the ones on, kind of like facts and figures about Canadian alcohol consumption and drinking patterns, who drinks, even some of the stuff on like how exactly alcohol is produced and distillation and that stuff. I know about a lot of that stuff. I frankly don't care too much. I like to focus a lot more on kind of like what a substance is doing in terms of its mechanism of action and how it produces its effects and what you could see in people and their behavior. I care a lot less about, at least for a psychopharmacology class, I care a lot less about, trends and, stuff like that. You can just easily Google stuff like that. But anyway, that's not my call. So I'll present some of these slides to you as best as I can. Okay, so what does alcohol consumption look like in a Canadian context? Okay, well, for a while now, we've known that alcohol is, well, first of all, it's very widely consumed. It's one of the most accessible psychoactive substances out there. It is one of the most normalized and socially normative, kind of acceptable substances, non-stigmatized substances outside of contexts like addiction, by the way. But a very wide variety of Canadians consume alcohol. Now, of course, there are caveats here, right? For religious and cultural reasons and just personal reasons. Some of them having to do with health, right? It's much like fasting, right? Like for some people, fasting is a religious and cultural practice that is deeply embedded into their spirituality and their faith. For others, it's a health choice, right? They do it for the health benefits. They do it for discipline and kind of like strength of will, right? And like improved self-regulation, whatever, right? Or to just benefit their routine. Well, alcohol consumption and alcohol abstention, okay, is really similar here. Regardless of the reason, many people in Canada consume alcohol. Okay, but as we'll see, most of the alcohol consumed by Canadians is consumed by a relatively small portion of all that alcohol that is consumed. So it's a weird thing that I'm saying, but you'll see how this makes sense in a moment. Beer tends to be the most common. Okay, significantly outsells wine and spirits or liquors, as we're saying. 12% of Canadians. I'm not sure how recent this is, by the way, but I'm guessing if Dan put this in, it'd be pretty recent. 12% of Canadians apparently self-identify as abstinent, so no alcohol whatsoever. I don't drink whatsoever, while 5% self-identify as heavy drinkers. So this heavy here is a relative term, and it's defined just kind of operationally here as, 5+ drinks at least once a week for a year. Okay, that means 5+ drinks. I'm guessing here over the course of the week, not necessarily in one sitting. Heavy drinking is 4 times more prevalent in men than women. That's been a very common trend. It hasn't changed for a long time. So men tend to drink far more than women. Heavy drinking is more common in persons 15 to 24 years of age, especially men who are 15 to 24 years of age. And it is 3 times more prevalent than in anyone that is 25 years of age or older. There's this interesting kind of fact here that 80% of alcohol is consumed by only 20% of the population. That is pretty interesting. That's what I meant before by saying that most of the alcohol that's consumed is consumed by a relatively small portion of, 20% is huge, okay, when you think of it, right? But that's a relatively small portion of the population, okay? So, as we talked about, men tend to drink far more than women. And they are more likely to drink when they drink far more. So not just far more in general, right? So just kind of like more frequently and in greater preponderance, okay? But when they do drink, they tend to drink in greater amounts, okay? Drinking, as we know, is common among post-secondary students. I was trying to say common among college students. I'm just going to switch to post-secondary, okay? College students tend to drink far more than their non-student peers, which says something about the culture of the campuses of post-secondary institutions, which thankfully in most parts of Canada have banned the sale and advertising of alcohol, and many fraternities have now banned keg parties. This has kind of embedded itself now into like frosh weeks as well, which is probably a good thing. Alcohol use and drinking behavior hasn't changed significantly in response to this, unfortunately. Like with many other forms of substance use, people will just find a way to use substances, including alcohol, even if you place deterrents on their behavior. Today's college students are less likely to drink and drive compared to students in the 1980s, which is a great statistic, by the way. We'll talk more about that. And as I talked about, culture has a huge impact on consumption patterns, right? In certain cultures, it is very common, even for children, right, to be introduced to alcohol at a very young age under the supervision of their parents. In some cultures, alcohol is completely prohibited, right? Even as a matter of kind of divine and religious sanction. For example, it's not the only one, but I know very well that Islam, right, has a prohibition, right, against intoxicating substances like alcohol, right. It is built into the faith that relationship, right, to a substance is just prohibited on its face. Okay, in other cultures, alcohol use is almost religiously in a secular way prescribed. Okay, there's a lot of variety on this planet when it comes to alcohol, so I just wanted to put that out there. Okay, so again, just for the next few slides, I'm going to be going through some things that I normally wouldn't take a lot of time reviewing, but I think it's important, not only because it was covered by Dan in his last iterations of the course, but because, look, some of you might not know some of these more foundational, just basic structural features of what alcohol is and how it gets produced and kind of its place in society. So the first thing to note is that historically, alcohol, and even to this day, has had medicinal uses. I mean, like largely alcohol has very little medicinal. It's a poison, right? It's not like but then again, like the radiation treatment is poisonous to human beings, but it can help in oncological settings, right? With the treatment of cancer, it's a poison, but it's not used in oral administration anymore. To like it used to be put in tonics and like tinctures, it used to be put in cough syrup, and all sorts of weird things like that. Really, the use medicinally of alcohol these days is restricted to kind of anesthetic and sterilizing properties. In rare cases is it ever used for sedation. It's usually not used in kind of like the scientifically developed world for purposes of sedation. It's very dangerous. The primary use of alcohol in today's world is recreational. Okay, unless we're talking about like rubbing alcohol or like sterilizing alcohol, it is primarily recreational. Okay, the basis for alcohol, okay, for all alcoholic beverages is fermentation. Fermentation is what happens when yeasts act on sugar in water. You get fermentation, okay, when you combine those three elements together. Okay. Why does alcohol so often come from fruit, right? Like wine comes from grapes, and you have vodka coming from you have all these alcohols that have like at least partly a basis in fruit. Well, historically, especially, okay, fruit, okay, as we all know, contain natural sugars. Okay, so if you add yeast to the sugar that is in a fruit, for example, in the case of grapes, you get alcohol. Okay, many grains, okay, contain sugar, right? Such as maltose, and can be fermented, right? The best example of this is malted barley, okay, which contains pretty high amounts of starch and fructose, and is therefore fermented in that way to create most of the beers that we know of today. Now, there are very many offshoots of this, but you can consider this to be a kind of fundamental, starting point for what most beers are considered like today. Now, fermentation is the basis of alcohol, okay? If you want to yield alcohol that is stronger than about 15%, okay, you need to move beyond fermentation, okay, just yeasts acting on sugars, right, and water, okay? You need distillation. Distillation is the evaporation and condensation of the vapors of alcohol to produce alcoholic liquids or beverages with a content higher than 15%. Fun fact, this was probably first used in the Arab world, okay, somewhere around 800 AD, which is kind of cool. It was introduced into Europe in about the 10th century. And then the U.S., it began large-scale production around the end of the 18th century, okay, which is pretty cool. And these are just examples of two distilling methods, two stills. Just a few more quick things before we get to what I think is the more interesting stuff. Like when we start talking about that, the actual psychopharmacology of alcohol, or I'll provide a better general introduction, and then we'll get into the pharmacology. The product of distillation is sometimes called a distilled spirit, right? That's what you get when you practice distillation, okay? A key concept we need here when we're talking about distilled spirits, this is very similar, by the way, to the difference between like odds and chances. We're going to talk about that in my second semester course in Addictions 2 when we talk about problem gambling. There's a kind of mathematical equivalence here. The notion of proof, okay? You may have heard of certain, beverages being known as 80 proof or 90 proof, okay? Proof is alcohol content of a distilled beverage, okay, or a distilled spirit. It is twice the percentage of alcohol by weight. And when we're talking about alcohol by weight, that's when you hear things like, or when you see on a bottle or a label, percentage, okay, 40%, 45%. So for example, 90 proof whiskey is 45% alcohol. 40% rum is 80 proof rum. Okay, like it's just, or like 40% alcohol is 80 proof rum. Whatever it is, okay? Like an easy way of thinking of this is just twice. Okay, think of double here, okay? Now, a grain neutral spirit, okay, tends to produce an extremely high distillate, okay? Very high distilled product. It's a clear, tasteless, nearly pure alcohol, 190 proof, okay? That is produced by distillation. Sometimes it's sold as what's known as Everclear, by the way, one of my favorite bands growing up. That kind of makes me old. And it's used in commercial products, usually sold as a gasoline additive, a cleaner or a solvent. Unfortunately, I've also seen people drink it. Yeah. You see a lot of things when you work in a detox, by the way. Not good times. Okay, so now we're moving into the part of the class where we're going to really start talking about alcohol proper, okay? It's like what alcohol is, what it does, why it matters, okay? So first we're going to talk about just one thing I like to say to people is, from a clinical kind of frontline worker perspective, I often hear from people, parents and administrators, even law enforcement sometimes will come to me and be like, "Oh, Carl, what do you think is the most dangerous drug out there? Is it meth? Is it fentanyl?" And those are pretty scary drugs on their own terms. Like they are objectively, not green smoothies. Okay, so they're not, they're not anything that I would recommend that anyone partake in. Okay, they are dangerous. They are absolutely dangerous drugs. But for my money, alcohol is the grand champion statistically, okay, for being associated with the most psychological, physical, biological, social, and even spiritual harm. No contest. Maybe cigarettes come close to it, okay? I would defend that claim against anyone. Okay, alcohol statistically is associated with the most harm. I am more afraid to learn that one of my clients is a chronic and heavy drinker than I am that they are a chronic and heavy opiate user. Both are scary, by the way. Opiate use chronically and heavily is very scary, but for many reasons. Okay, alcohol is a bit scarier. After all, alcohol is the only substance, maybe next only to the benzodiazepines and barbiturates, for which there is a life-threatening withdrawal syndrome. We'll come back to that later, okay? But for many other reasons, okay, alcohol is really scary. Okay, before we get there though, okay, alcohol is the most widely used and abused drug. No contest. Okay, it's just, 75 to 85% of the population use alcohol in the West. Okay, that is a lot of people. Okay, now again, remember that number in a Canadian context. 80% of the alcohol that's consumed is consumed by a relatively smaller amount of people, 20% only, okay? But still, that's a lot of people. 7% of the adult population in Western cultures are in advanced stages of chronic abuse. Now, what this says, by the way, this is a very general theme in addictions work, okay? Drugs are not these terrifying things that, if anyone tries them, they will immediately become addicted. No, not at all. So many factors, only some of which are psychopharmacological. Other factors like trauma and, the early adverse childhood experiences, lack of coping skills, personality and temperament factors, a lack of a supportive network, right? So many other factors will determine whether or not you become, quote, addicted or you develop a problematic relationship with a substance, okay? That's true of any substance, by the way, right? Addiction is not a matter of the drug. It's a matter of a lot of other things. Okay, the drug plays a part, for sure. Okay, and how you put it into your body plays a part, for sure. But the fact that only 7%, okay, 7% of people in the West, while there's 75 to 85% of us that are drinking alcohol in this case, and only 7% of us develop problems. If it was just alcohol, all of us would have problems. Okay, there's got to be something going on here. We'll be talking about that. I hope you talk a little bit about that in your Addictions 1 course. We'll be talking a little bit more about that too in my Trauma course and in my Addictions 2 course. Okay, alcohol, again, there's a reason why I say it's the grand champion of harm. It's the most widely associated with crime, with violence, with behavioral toxicity, physiological toxicity, and some social deviance. You name it, okay? They are brutal. Only tobacco and the synthetic opiates like fentanyl and carfentanil and, the oxys, only those rival alcohol in terms of overall substance-related harms. But alcohol is still the most damaging, all else being equal, okay? So we will We will kind of come back to some of this in a bit more detail, but that's just a way of laying out what we're dealing with. Okay, so now that we've already covered a lot of these pharmacokinetic concepts like route of administration and absorption and metabolism and elimination, I'm not going to have to go through what they mean again. I can just kind of use them. That's why we have fundamental concepts. We can apply them later in the course. Okay, let's talk about the fundamentals of alcohol. Okay, the route of administration for alcohol is almost exclusively, I can't believe I have to say almost exclusively and not just exclusively, almost exclusively drinking, but it can also be injected, believe it or not, and even inhaled. And more recently, as we learned in the story of my client, again, not real name, but my client Brooke, as I call her, it can be inserted into one of those two mucous membrane linings that we talked about. Its absorption is both lipid and fat soluble. So remember, that means, okay, if it's more lipid soluble, remember, I hope this was covered again, okay? If it's lipid soluble, that means that it can pass through a certain barrier. Not your skin. There's another really important barrier. What am I thinking of? I'm talking to you as if you're here. The blood-brain barrier, okay? That is the real, like, the OG gatekeeper, okay, for psychoactive substances. All drugs have to have at least some lipid solubility or they are not getting in. And if they're not getting in through the blood-brain barrier, they cannot do squat. Okay? Alcohol is very lipid soluble and it is water soluble. What does that mean again? What is water solubility? That means it can distribute, it can transport itself through your blood far more quickly. Water solubility is really, we're made mostly of water. Makes sense. Okay? Next, alcohol is readily and rapidly absorbed and metabolized. 95% of it, okay, is metabolized. The other 5% is eliminated from your body unchanged, either in the form of sweat, of breath, or in your urine, okay? 20% of it gets absorbed by your stomach, okay? Which means that you tend to absorb more alcohol on an empty stomach, okay? And you absorb less alcohol on a full stomach that has lots of water, okay? That's because of the so-called dilution factor that we'll get to later. The rest of alcohol, 80% of it, is absorbed by your small intestine. Okay, stomach contents, as I talked about before, maybe in a little bit too much detail, because now I'm just going to kind of repeat it. Repetition kind of helps with understanding, I find, okay? Your stomach contents, what's actually in your stomach, don't affect, okay, how much alcohol you absorb. Like you're going to absorb it and you're therefore going to feel it. They affect instead the rate at which alcohol gets absorbed. How fast is alcohol going to get absorbed and therefore start producing its effects? So drinking on a full stomach is still going to get you drunk, okay? It's going to get you very intoxicated, just more slowly, okay? And eating 3 large pizzas is not going to prevent you from getting drunk, okay? Alcohol is evenly distributed throughout the body fluids and tissue, including the brain, okay? This is very important, by the way. We'll come back to this, especially as it relates to gender differences. There's an important term here that many of you should know, okay? It's not just going to be important in your clinical professional lives, okay? This is the kind of language that we use out there in the world when we talk about alcohol and the clients that we work with. It'll be important for you as well, personally. If ever you decide to partake of alcohol, or if you know anyone in your life personally who is, BAC, or blood alcohol concentration, is the measure of the amount of alcohol that is in your blood at any given time. Okay, it's affected by many factors, as we'll see. It's affected by how heavy you are, okay, your weight. It's affected by how much muscle mass you have, and it's affected by your current body fluids, okay, including the fluid, okay, in your stomach, including the fluid throughout your body, okay. Impairment is very likely, regardless of who you are, at 50 milligram percent, okay, and death is likely at 600, okay, milligram by percentage. What this means, okay, is if your BAC is at 600, okay, mg, okay, you are very likely to die. Okay, that is pretty much for any human being. Doesn't matter what your tolerance is. No one can take more than that. Okay, so as I've been hinting to you, there are very clear differences, okay, in how alcohol gets absorbed and processed, and therefore how it affects men and women. Generally speaking, women tend to be far more susceptible than men to the effects of alcohol, i.e., they exhibit a higher blood alcohol concentration after consuming the exact same amount for two reasons, okay? First of all is metabolism, okay? Men, okay, tend to produce far more of a stomach enzyme that we're going to learn a bit more about later called alcohol dehydrogenase, okay? Alcohol dehydrogenase, okay, already starts to metabolize or break down alcohol once alcohol gets into your stomach. Remember, alcohol first has to get to your stomach, then gets to the liver for first pass metabolism, okay? This means that women absorb a greater proportion of the alcohol that they drink as compared with men because women produce less of this stomach enzyme. So less of it's getting broken down from the get-go, okay? The second reason, okay, is that women tend to weigh less, but have a higher proportion of, don't hate me, okay? It's just a physiological fact that is drummed into our anatomy for evolutionary reasons. Women have a higher proportion of body fat for a whole bunch of really important evolutionary reasons, okay? Which means, we're not going to get into them, that they have less water in their bodies. Less water in your bodies. Think of this as a kind of tank in your body, okay? Men have a lot more water in their tank, okay? So the alcohol that they drink gets diluted by way more water in their tank. Women have a lot less of it, okay? Which means that there's less of a dilution factor. That means more alcohol gets absorbed for women, okay, than for men. On average, okay, if you were to kind of calculate this, again, there are differences, okay, but on average, this means that women require approximately 2/3 of the amount of alcohol, okay, given the same, right, like, to reach, the same blood alcohol concentration and the same central nervous system effects, the same psychoactive effects as men. Among other reasons, not like you were looking for a reason, okay, but among other reasons, this is why women, okay, should not be going shot for shot with men, okay? Are there differences, by the way? Okay, are there differences that would make a difference? Yes, of course, okay? If you took, like, a supremely muscular, lean woman, okay, and you put her up against a man, okay, who was extremely, okay, morbidly obese, very high fat content, okay, in terms of biomass. Well, yes, the dilution factor here, okay, would be nullified, okay? It would be nullified because you had a very lean, muscular woman with a very large male that had a higher proportion of body fat, not baddie fat, baddie as if he's a bad, okay, body fat, okay, but the metabolism factor would not be changed. That man, regardless of his weight and body fat percentage, would still produce more alcohol dehydrogenase. Make sense? Hope so. Okay, here's where things get fun. Okay, whenever you see a slide that says mechanism of action, interpret that as just a fancy way of saying, how does it do it? How does it work? How is alcohol able to do what it does? Okay, that's what mechanism of action is. You'll see this for every other substance we talk about. Every substance will have at least one slide that says mechanism of action. Okay, so how does it work? So alcohol tends to have what I call a 1-2 punch. a 1-2 depressant punch. It means it does its depressant action in two ways that are additive. Okay, so again, just reminding ourselves, alcohol is a central nervous system depressant. I really hope that in the class on pharmacodynamics, that it was explained to you that a depressant is not something that makes you depressed. Well, sometimes it could produce that kind of effect, ostensibly, outwardly, okay, but not necessarily. In fact, the depressant effect of most depressants, okay, are disinhibiting behaviorally. You might even see someone become more aggressive, right? More likely to take risks, more talkative. Okay, as we'll see later, we'll talk more about this. But for now, just keep in mind that alcohol is a depressant at the level of the central nervous system. That's the class of drug that it is. It does this in two ways. First, okay, by amplifying, by enhancing the already natural, look at that, inhibitory effect of GABA. Okay, a very important primary inhibitory neurotransmitter of the nervous system. Okay, at the GABA A receptor. Okay, not so important that you know it's a GABA A receptor. Not a big deal. Just know that it amplifies the naturally inhibitory effect of GABA. Okay, at higher doses, this is the second punch. Okay, the first punch, okay, that one is enhancing the naturally inhibitory effect of GABA. That's almost like, giving more power to the brakes, okay, within your nervous system. The second effect, though, okay, is by blocking, by inhibiting, by preventing the action of your accelerator, okay, your naturally excitatory neurotransmitter known as glutamate. So that's the 1-2 punch of alcohol. Amplifies GABA, which usually slows things down. That's the first depressant effect. And then it blocks, okay, it mitigates the activity or interferes, with the activity of glutamate, what's usually exciting things. Okay, so you get a lot of depressant effect. Alcohol also affects dopamine, serotonin, and acetylcholine, many other systems as well. But we know, though, just by these three additional impacts, okay, it produces differential effects on many different areas of functioning, including your reward system, your motor skills, your coordination, your mood, your emotion regulation, as well as your learning and memory storage. There are many physiological effects of alcohol consumption. We're going to focus on some kind of acute physiological effects of alcohol consumption. Okay, and these are peripheral dilation, the inhibition of a really important hormone called antidiuretic hormone, or ADH. There are some effects on sleep, and then some effects on peripheral vision. Okay, having to do with perception more generally. Okay, so peripheral dilation is enlarged blood vessels, near the surface of your skin. Okay. This primarily causes your core body temperature to drop, okay? This is why, by the way, you should never give alcohol to anyone who is in a state of extreme cold exposure, like like hypothermia, okay? If someone is in a state of hypothermia, you should absolutely not give them alcohol. It might make them feel warm. Okay, alcohol gives this kind of pernicious illusion of kind of acute warmthness, okay? But it's actually causing your core body temperature to drop. It can accelerate the effects of something like hypothermia. Next is the inhibition of antidiuretic hormone. That's a fancy way of saying it makes you pee a lot, okay? It's just, I'm sorry. That's basically what this is. Anti means like kind of against or preventing. Diuretic refers to water, okay, or like fluids, okay? So an antidiuretic hormone is the thing that prevents you from constantly peeing all the time uncontrollably. Alcohol, inhibits that hormone. In other words, it causes you to pee more often, okay? At higher levels, antidiuresis occurs, which is swelling of extremities. Not good, by the way, okay? Alcohol also notoriously affects sleep. it affects sleep in so many ways, especially the quality of sleep. So you might feel like you are falling asleep far more easily. You might feel like sleep is more easily attainable. You might even feel like when you sleep, oh my God, I was out cold. I was, the quality of your sleep is terrible. It's barely restorative. You're usually waking up several times in the middle of the night without even noticing it. Specifically, it reduces the duration of a really important stage of sleep known as rapid eye movement, or REM. And there's a rebound effect, right? So in withdrawal, right, you will experience sleep disturbances and nightmares. Okay, so if alcohol was doing anything to help you with any of your sleep problems, which it usually doesn't, or at least it only produces the illusion of helping you, when you remove it, one of the effects will be increased disturbances. There's a similar rebound effect we're going to talk about with sleeping pills later, okay? And then peripheral vision is impacted. Peripheral vision decreases as your blood alcohol concentration rises. This is one of the major causes, by the way, of car accidents, because alcohol affects not just reaction time, it affects not just depth perception, but it affects your ability to see what is around you. Okay, peripheral vision is not just seeing, okay, right in front of your face in a straight line. It's being able to capture a visual scene in its entirety, not in full detail. It's impossible to have like arachnid vision that sees everything in like 8 cameras. But peripheral vision allows you to notice things coming in to the peripheries, the sides, right? Where you are not currently orienting your attention as a focal point, okay? Alcohol dulls that, and that is a huge cause of, among other things, car accidents. Okay, how does alcohol move through your body? We talked a little bit about this, right? Alcohol, remember, is water soluble, so it moves nicely through the body. Your blood alcohol concentration, okay, is a measure of the concentration of alcohol in your blood, expressed as a percentage of grams per 100 milliliters, as we saw before. Remember, I probably took out this slide earlier. So there's a slide on that has Bruce Lee and Jillian Michaels that I removed. Anyway, the whole point of this is alcohol is distributed throughout the body fluids, but it's far less distributed in fatty tissues. Again, this is what accounts for the dilution kind of difference between men and women in terms of how they absorb alcohol. A lean person will have a lower blood alcohol concentration than a person of the same weight with higher body fat. Usually, again, generally speaking, not always, generally speaking, that means that women will absorb more alcohol than men because they have less fluids into the tank of their body in which to dilute alcohol. Okay? And then there's a metabolic factor. Okay? How does alcohol get metabolized in the body? Well, the primary organ that metabolizes most things, by the way, is your liver. Okay, these are sometimes known, if I remember correctly, I think they're the CYP450 enzymes in the liver. Okay, but the liver metabolizes alcohol at a rate of about 0.25 to 0.30 ounces of alcohol per hour. Okay, and for context, by the way, a standard drink, okay, so a drink in terms of Ontario is a 0.5 ounces. Okay, so that's something to keep in mind, right? It means you're only really processing a standard drink and therefore eliminating it eventually like around like an hour and 15, an hour and a half usually, okay? Now, how does alcohol intoxication work? Well, this might sound really silly and obvious to you, but it's good to spell it out this way, okay? If the rate of intake, okay, is equal to the rate at which you are metabolizing or breaking down alcohol, then your blood alcohol concentration remains the same. Okay? If the intake is equal to how much you're processing, the blood alcohol concentration stays the same. If your rate of intake exceeds metabolism, okay, so if you are taking in more alcohol than you are able to process, then your blood alcohol concentration will rise. It's as simple as that. Okay, so as I mentioned before, and I can't believe I remembered this, by the way, it's just one of those facts that, like, I don't know if you're going to be really tested on this, if you have to know exactly what this family of enzymes is called, but it's a cool thing to remember, okay? The drug is what's processing and metabolizing the drug, is that what I said? The liver is what's metabolizing, oh my goodness, too many coffees, alcohol in your body. And within the liver, there is a family of enzymes known as CYP450. These enzymes can speed up the rates of reaction, okay? So as you consume alcohol, the activity of these CYP450 enzymes increase, which thereby increases your metabolic and dispositional tolerance. What does that mean? Well, remember from the fundamental concepts, and again, I hope this was covered, like there are all sorts of different types of tolerance out there. There's pharmacodynamic, there's behavioral tolerance, there's also metabolic tolerance. The more that you consume alcohol over time, you increase the activity of this family of enzymes, which therefore increases your general overall baseline metabolic functioning. What does that mean? Okay, it just means that the more you drink, the better you become at metabolizing. But that's not a good thing, as we'll see later. That puts a lot of stress on your liver. And as we'll see, one of the main causes of especially fatal issues in terms of alcohol consumption over time is the overall kind of long-term degradation of liver functioning, starting with fatty liver and then eventually, the worst case scenario, cirrhosis, which is an irreversible type of damage to your liver. Okay, so with these building blocks in place, we're now able to tell a more complete and cohesive story, pharmacokinetic story of the journey of alcohol within your body. Okay, so one really important part of the story, by the way, is only going to become very clear later on when we talk about one of the what used to be a very popular but very controversial pharmacological treatment of alcohol dependence. Okay, it's still used to some extent today, but there is controversy around it. And although it is very effective for some, it could potentially be not only ineffective for others, but dangerous for others. Anyway, that'll come later. So first, when alcohol enters your body, okay, remember there was this enzyme, okay, that is more active in men. Okay, this accounted for one of the sex-based differences. Okay, with respect to how alcohol is processed, okay, absorbed, and therefore how much alcohol is required to produce a certain blood alcohol concentration. Okay, well, men produce more of this first enzyme called alcohol dehydrogenase. Okay, so when alcohol enters the body, okay, its first major kind of metabolic stage is to get converted into, and I can never pronounce this properly, at least I have a way of pronouncing this, and I think the British have another way of pronouncing this, acetaldehyde. If that's not the right way, or some of the nurses in class are going to correct me for sure, that's okay. Okay, but it gets converted into this. One thing I do know about it, though, is that it's a very toxic substance. Okay? Acetaldehyde is not something you want in your body, okay, especially in large amounts. The good thing, okay, is that once acetaldehyde is present in the body, okay, another enzyme comes in, okay, the so-called acetaldehyde dehydrogenase enzyme, okay, that converts acetaldehyde into the far less problematic substance, okay, in your body known as acetic acid, or some people say acetic acid. I call it acetic acid. Okay, and then finally, once alcohol has been converted down this metabolic chain into acetic acid, it then gets converted into CO2 and H2O. Okay, 95% of alcohol is broken down finally in this way. Okay, finally into CO2 and H2O. 5% of it, as we mentioned before, is excreted purely as alcohol. Okay. So So that's an interesting metabolic story. Like I said, we'll come back to why this story is relevant, but I'll give you a hint right now. That popular, or at least used to be very popular and somewhat controversial pharmacological intervention takes place, okay, once alcohol has been converted into acetaldehyde by the alcohol dehydrogenase enzyme. There is a substance that actually blocks the conversion of acetaldehyde into acetic acid. You might ask, why the heck would you want to do that? Well, because it doesn't feel good if you've got acetaldehyde in your system. I'll come back to that later. Actually, let's just get into it right now. Okay. While we're telling this story about the pharmacokinetic journey of alcohol in the body, okay, I told you that there's this step, right? Once alcohol dehydrogenase has converted, okay, alcohol into acetaldehyde, okay, well, the normal course of things, right? In a healthy human body, acetaldehyde should be converted as soon as possible into acetic acid, because acetic acid is terrible for the body. At least it's toxic, okay? And in large amounts, it feels terrible to have in there, okay? It causes nausea. Some people report even like feeling like they're kind of like their chest is kind of like compressed, like almost like someone's pushing in. You get headaches. You might even just feel like really like sick, okay? It's not enjoyable. It is, in some cases, people report even just like soreness, quite severe physical pain. There is a drug that is given to people that we're going to talk about right here, okay, that purposefully blocks this move from the conversion naturally of acetaldehyde into acetic acid. Okay, it prevents alcohol from being broken down at this step in the process. Okay, so I'll show you that diagram again in the next slide to give you a sense of this. But this is why antabuse, or what's sometimes called disulfiram, okay, is an aversive technique. In other words, it creates a punishment for consuming alcohol. If you choose to consume alcohol, well, it's not going to feel good, because that normal process of converting alcohol from acetaldehyde into acetic acid will be blocked. And so you'll have a buildup of this toxic acetaldehyde in your body. It causes nausea, sweating, rapid pulse. Again, for some people, pain and compression. It doesn't feel good at all, because it allows for acetaldehyde, again, which is toxic, to remain in the body without breaking it down. It actually stays in your system. It stays in the body for several days after you administer it. It's very helpful, therefore, for binge drinkers. Okay, so imagine someone heading into the weekend. Okay, it's a Friday, and they usually tend to drink, Friday night, Saturday night, even like Sunday a little bit too. Taking it on a Friday morning, okay, would keep you in this state of, toxic acetaldehyde buildup if you were to consume alcohol. It has some counterindications that we won't get into, but again, the idea here, and what makes it so controversial, is that it is a form of aversive therapy, right? Like, you are causing people to not only not feel rewarded by their consumption of alcohol, you're causing pain. Right, you are causing distress in someone, but here's what kind of lifts some of that controversy. People are voluntarily engaging in this. People are not just being, kind of slipped antabuse into their, into their morning coffee or something. Like, this is something that you have to voluntarily agree to do. And this is just what it looks like in diagram form. Okay, so if we come back to the diagram from from 2 slides back, okay, this just kind of makes clear where antabuse is doing its thing. Okay, it prevents the breakdown of alcohol from acetaldehyde to acetic acid. Okay, that's all it's doing. And very briefly, we're going to talk about naltrexone. Okay, I think its brand name these days mostly goes by Revia. There's another one too, but anyway, alcohol, naltrexone, okay, if you've heard of naloxone, naltrexone, drugs in this family are usually associated with the opiates, okay? They're usually used for other reasons with the opiates. We're going to save that later. It's an opiate receptor, opioid receptor antagonist, okay? But one thing that it does, partly because, again, alcohol and the opiates are in a very similar, deeper kind of depressant family, even though opiates are analgesics, it causes a reduction in cravings and reduced levels of drinking, therefore. Okay. That's really cool. And it does work for a lot of people. The problem is that physiologically, it's very hard to metabolize. Okay, it's hard for your liver to break it down, so it's not recommended with anyone who's been chronically heavily using alcohol over a long period of time and has therefore accumulated liver damage. Okay, it's best suited to people who haven't accumulated this damage and who are in early recovery, but steadily using. Okay, and that one of the reasons, kind of clinically, that's been identified for their ongoing use is a difficulty in managing and making intelligent decisions in response to their craving. There's a newer, longer acting form. That's what I forgot. It's right here. It's called Vivitrol. So Revia is the original, and Vivitrol is a longer acting injectable form. So it just means you don't have to dose as often as you would with something like Revia.